Cars with two engines, considered a drunken automotive fantasy for most, thank Hot Wheels for that, it's actually not the worst idea in the world. There are many drag racers and hot rods with the configuration, and even an F1 car, all using two engines to send power to the rear wheels. But that's not today's topic. Instead, I'm talking about cars using one engine to power the front wheels, and another to power the rear ones. I should start with the elephant in the room. This is by no means a common configuration. I can only find two production cars that used it, so in this video I will also be covering manufacturer-built prototypes and modified cars from larger tuning companies. Think of it as a spiritual sequel to those Group B videos from a while ago. By far the most famous of these twin-engined creations is a Citroën 2CV Sahara. I was surprised to learn when researching this video that less than 700 Saharas were built. I've never known much about 2CVs, and had always assumed production was around the 2,500 mark. In a similar manner to later off-road variants of French cars such as the Dangel Peugeot 505, visual differences were minimal. In this case, a bonnet-mounted spare wheel, cutaway rear arch covers, and a recessed boot lid to allow for cooling of the rear motor. The overall impact of these changes though, like the 505, is that it transforms the rather cartoony 2CV into quite a capable looking little machine. It had the off-road ability to back the looks up too, as it boosted the standard 2CV's decent off-road ability even further, thanks to the four-wheel drive and extra power. The installation of a second engine meant the compact layout had to be reshuffled. The fuel tank, for example, was split in two and relocated under the front seats, accessible via the filler caps in the doors. Later renamed to the 2CV 4x4, due to the extensive changes, the cost was almost double that of a standard car, meaning sales were few and survivors fewer still. Fleet users, taking advantage of the car's capability in rural and mountainous areas, including the Swiss Postal Service and the Spanish police. The other, rather less famous production car in this extremely niche category came around 25 years earlier than the Sahara. This was the Tempo G1200, so named because it had two 600cc two-cylinder engines, hence 1200cc. The name sounds rather like a cassette player, yes, but the G1200 was far more serious than that. The company that built it, Tempo, was a German light utility vehicle company that existed for just over 50 years, owners Daimler-Benz retiring the name in 1977. The G1200 was developed in 1936 as a light military off-roader. Think Willys Jeep, Kubelwagen, that sort of thing. In fact, the Kubelwagen could be considered as the G1200's main rival, both having been trialled and accepted into Wehrmacht service during World War II. But while the heavily Beetle-based Kubelwagen was almost exclusively built for said Wehrmacht, the Tempo was exported worldwide. This was mainly because the German army was very apprehensive of accepting a new four-wheel drive model into service, having their hands full already with a similarly four-wheel drive, but extremely heavy BMW 325. One army for which the G1200 was a particular favourite were the Finns, as the car's dual two-stroke engines coped with sub-zero temperatures extremely well. Another of the Tempo's quirks, four-wheel steering, was also useful to the Finnish army, as it allowed the car to easily navigate through dense woodland. Despite the lukewarm reception from its home country, the Tempo G1200 proved itself to be a capable, if a bit over-engineered, military vehicle over the course of its service life. The same cannot be said, however, for that other twin-engined military design, the Twinny-Moke. While it was designed to answer the shortcomings found with the regular Mini-Moke by the British Army by offering four-wheel drive, it seems that British Leyland only did half the job. Yes, the traction issues found with the Moke were solved by the extra-driven wheels, but the far bigger problem was the complete lack of ground clearance, a problem not solved by the Twinny. Unsurprisingly, neither the British nor American armies had any interest in using such an unsuitable and complex vehicle, so the project was shelved. Despite its failure, the Twinny would live on in two very different ways. The first was in Leyland Australia's four-wheel drive Moke prototype. However, they only had one engine, so I won't be covering them here. The second I will be talking about though, and that is the Mini Cooper S Twin, also known as the Twinny Mini, to match the Moke's nickname. Inspired by the system fitted to the prototype Mokes, These would have been some of the first four-wheel drive works rally cars had they entered production. And that was certainly the goal, with high sales numbers predicted for this revolutionary 180 horsepower racer. But overheating and mechanical failure on the prototype's test run, the 1963 Targa Florio, made BMC wary of investing more into development, and the final nail in the coffin would come with John Cooper himself at the wheel. See, the Twinny used the standard Cooper S setup and subframe at the front, but then that setup was just duplicated at the back. This meant that at the back of the car, steering arms were still there, repurposed as suspension arms. Just prior to the crash, one of these came loose, causing one of the rear wheels to suddenly turn sharp right, while Cooper was driving at 100 miles an hour. A written-off Mini, a fractured skull and a swift end to development followed. I think we should move on to something more positive, the North Star V8. Yes, the world of twin-engine cars doesn't stop at 4 cylinders per end, perhaps regrettably in this case. This slightly odd-looking Cadillac Eldorado is the Mosler Twin Star. Yes, the banned from IMSA for being too fast, Mosler. And this wasn't a one-off, no, this was a production car. Almost. A customer would bring a donor Eldorado to Mosler, who would then stretch the wheelbase and chuck a second V8 into the back. I should probably note that the standard car was front-wheel drive. However, to add further complication, this second engine was not the same as the first. It was more powerful, 300 horsepower versus the front stock 275. This meant that the two engines had to operate separately, and that meant 2 transmissions, 2 sets of dials, 2 ignitions, and 2 times the price. Not too surprisingly, only 5 of the 575 horsepower Twin Stars were built, allegedly with 3 going to the same customer. They would be Mosler's only foray into the luxury car market, their other models all being blisteringly fast road legal racers, and the J10, which is a combination of Jeep CJ and Chevy S10. I don't know why either. Have you watched my second video on strange special editions? If so, you likely remember the mad-looking Mercedes A-Class Hakkinen and Coulthard F1 editions. Well, shockingly, they weren't the only insane A-Classes around at the time. I present the A38 AMG, a 250 brake horsepower 4-wheel drive rocket with perhaps the finest body kit a Halfords gift card can buy. Mercedes' work in developing the Smart 4.2 would likely have helped here, considering the below boot floor location of the rear engine in the A38. One example was gifted to Mika Hakkinen, but it's up for debate whether that was the only one built or not. Another debate is whether it being built in such few numbers is a good thing. The first gen A-Class doesn't have many fans. Continuing with the German theme, we come to a rather special Audi TT, the MTM Bimoto. Likely one of the more well-known cars in this video due to its record-breaking speed, the Bimoto made shockwaves upon its debut by recording a top speed of 232 miles an hour at Nardo. Not content with this, they would later go on to record 244 miles an hour, McLaren F1 rivaling speed, in an Audi TT. Admittedly, this was no ordinary TT, of course. The famous VW 1.8 turbo 4-cylinder was deployed front and rear for the Bimoto, producing anywhere between 350 and 500 horsepower each, depending on year and spec. Despite now having dual engines, the exterior of the MTM car was surprisingly standard, extra vents and an air scoop being the only clues as to the true nature of this vehicle. They also later fitted a Mark II TT grille for promotional reasons, which kinda ruins the front end for me. It looks like a kit car replica of itself. From Bimoto to Bimotore, this prototype based on the brilliant yet rust-prone Alphasud was developed in the mid-1970s using 2 TI-1200 drivetrains. The 4-wheel drive setup meant it could go from 0 to 60 miles an hour in about the time it took to say the full name, Alfa Romeo Alphasud TI Bimotore 4x4 Wayner. The Wayner part came from the nickname of Alfa's competition engineer, if you're wondering. While the Alfa was tested in multiple environments, it never competed, likely due to the complexity of the setup. You do need twice the drivetrain spares after all. External differences to the base car were somewhat restrained, with a set of black side intakes and a rubber spoiler being the main differences. It was also treated to a heavily branded works testing livery, and in this format sold at auction for around £55,000 in 2021. I wonder what would have happened had it reached competition and limited production, as it would have beaten the Quattro by a few years. The small engines used and the limited changes to the exterior do suggest it wasn't aiming for the top rally class, however, so perhaps its promotional and competitive impact would have been minimal, a possible reason for its cancellation. To the 1980s now, and another Italian rally car using the Bimotore name. This variant of the relatively short-lived Lancia Trevi used two of the Trevi Volume X's supercharged motors. It was built by Giorgio Pianta as part of the Delta S4's development, most prominently in the testing of the latter's bespoke Pirelli tyres. It's quite a nice looking thing, reminds me a little of the Peugeot 305 V6 prototype. Rally cars specifically had another benefit from the twin drivetrain layout, that being robustness and built-in redundancy. If a rally car's engine or gearbox failed, it would almost always spell the end of the rally for the team, but with two of each, they could continue on, albeit with a lot less power and two less driven wheels, but continue on nevertheless. This benefit wasn't just noticed by Lancia. The Seat Ibiza bimotor was the second 1980s rally prototype using the bimotor naming format. Rather less successful than the later rallying Ibizas, it was originally designed for Group S due to the 300 horsepower limit of the category. But as anybody who knows anything about rallying will know, Group S never happened, leaving the Ibiza bimotor to compete in Spanish national championships, albeit with little success. And then there were four. This is yet another Works rally prototype with the name bimotor, this time hailing from VW. The Scirocco bimotor was a curious Group B project meant to boost VW's brand image, while remaining distant from its Quattro stablemate. To this end, VW declined to use the iconic 5-cylinder from the latter, but did not have a suitable replacement that would provide enough power to make the four-wheel drive system worthwhile. To solve this issue, they simply abandoned the Quattro's drivetrain altogether, going with the dual-engine layout for cost reasons. Two prototypes were built, and production of the homologation cars seemed realistic enough that promotional materials were produced, touting its huge power figure and massive performance potential. The FIA, though, were not amused by this, telling VW in no uncertain terms that the crazy Scirocco would not be allowed to compete. This would be the end of the project, but not the end of dual-engine VWs in the 1980s. The Scirocco bimotor's predecessor was this yellow beast, the Jetta Twinjet. The project came about after the head of VW Motorsport stated he felt that Audi was overshadowing its parent company when it came to motorsport, which, in fairness, it was. The engineering was typical of many of the vehicles in this video, so that meant duplicated front suspension and drivetrain systems in the back, but the Twinjet did have a trick up its wide arch sleeve. This party trick was the ability to activate or deactivate each engine individually, so it could be a two-wheel drive at either end, or four-wheel drive, depending on the needs of the terrain. VW's final roll of the dual-engine dice came with this, the Golf Pikes Peak. Competing on that famous hill climb between 1985 and 87, the heavily modified Golf Mark II had different engines for each year. It started with two 1.8s, in a similar vein to its Jetta and Scirocco predecessors, but these lost too much power at higher altitudes and could only finish third that year. For 1986, the 1.8s were replaced with turbocharged 1.3s from the Polo, giving a total power figure of around 500 horsepower, but still the Golf was unsuccessful, finishing fourth. 1987 brought the return of 1.8 litre engines, but this time they featured turbochargers and over 300 horsepower each. This iteration of the car maintained the Twinjet selection fixture, but of course for the climb it would be all-wheel drive or nothing. That year the time to beat was set in perhaps the most iconic Pikes Peak car, an Audi Quattro S1E2. On the Golf's run, the halfway point times revealed that it was faster than the Audi, which had beat the previous record by 22 seconds earlier that day. Disaster struck just 2 corners from the finish, however, as a front swivel joint broke and the wheel collapsed. For some reason, VW would not continue competing with the Golf after 1987, so we will never know if it would have bested the Quattro up that Colorado mountain. Mention of Pikes Peak inevitably leads to Suzuki, and the red Escudo made famous in Gran Turismo. This particular car only had one engine though, so we're instead looking at Suzuki's prior efforts. Ironically enough, the first of these earlier Suzukis did actually feature in Gran Turismo 2, the Cultus Pikes Peak Special. Like all of their Pikes Peak creations, it was driven by Monster Tajima, who drove Cultuses, known as the Swift in Europe, the Geo Metro in America, for Suzuki's rally team, so presumably it felt quite familiar. Well, apart from the 800 horsepower from two 1.6 litre engines surrounding him, that is. This car competed through the early 1990s, before Tajima traded the Cultus silhouette for an Escudo one. This new car would stray even further from the road car in pursuit of speed, but the decision to switch to the design of the Escudo, Vitara, Tracker or Sidekick elsewhere made sense on paper. After all, Pikes Peak was still unpaved at this time, so promoting a 4x4 with a race up a gravel and dirt mountain track seems perfect. Power was boosted by another 100 horsepower over the Cultus, leading to a 1:1 power to weight ratio, 900 horsepower, 900 kilos. Still not satisfied that he had reached the peak of performance, pun fully intended, Tajima will keep developing the concept into the now iconic version, which sadly for this video only had the one engine. If Suzuki supporting a mad high-performance rally machine seems surprising, what about a brand even more rarely associated with such cars? Enter the Wartburg 353 Duo, or 353 Quattro depending on source. Now, Wartburg 353s did have an extensive history of rallying, as did the equally panned Trabant for that matter, but in the West they were more often relegated to the Novelty Act, being compared unfavourably to the decadent Lanciers and Escorts. The Duo used the same competition 3-cylinder as a standard rally car, along with a duplicate in place of the rear seats, Clio V6 style. Now, 4-wheel drive in a Wartburg may seem pointless due to the lack of power, but the 353 rally cars actually produced up to 105 horsepower, meaning a dual engine setup would have been more powerful than the previously mentioned Alphacid 4x4. Also, in a detail that makes me smile, the rear engine bay cover seems to have been trimmed in the same material as the rest of the interior, so it looks like it's in a big suitcase. This attempt at subtlety also extended to the exterior, the only additions to the 2-wheel drive rally car being a red splitter and small rear spoiler. This makes it look almost subtle, a nice break after the spoiler-festooned Suzukis. But if it's a subtle twin-engine car you want, this next one always qualifies as a sleeper. Unfamiliar to my European audience, this is a Chevy Citation X11, the performance variant of a rather derided US hatchback, which reminds me of the old Scirocco's. But why is it here? Surely Chevrolet wasn't mad enough to stuff 2 engines into the American equivalent of a hot hatch. That assumption is correct, at least for production cars. What we have here is a test mule, those most elusive of creations, often built before a car's final design is even finalised, to test drivetrains and other systems. Particularly interesting examples include the Ford Transit XJ220 engine test vehicle, the Maestro van-bodied Freelander, probably my personal favourite, and the Holden Ute-based Siet Corvette mule. Speaking of Corvettes, that brings me to the reason why this Citation had 2 engines. At the time, GM management were concerned that the V8 wouldn't have a future ahead of it, and so were hurriedly working on smaller units for use in the Corvette especially. This prototype, nicknamed the Push Me Pull Me, had 2 identical V6s, which were originally 130 horsepower 2.8s, before being upgraded to 200 horsepower aluminium 3.1s. The original idea was that using 2 V6s would compensate for the lack of a V8, but this stance soon changed, and the concept was abandoned. From the most subtle car in this video to one of the least subtle cars ever designed, this behemoth is the 2006 Isdera Autobahn Courier 116i, no relation to the BMW. In fact, the Isdera, yes that Isdera, used 2 Mercedes V8s, as Isdera tended to use Mercedes parts in a similar manner to Pagani. 2 V8s meant 16 cylinders, hence the name. Unlike the other cars in this video, the 116i had both engines crammed under the enormous bonnet. Inspiration came from the ultra-luxury coupes of the 1930s, such as the Bugatti Royale and the Mercedes 540k, but I think the end result skews more towards the Excalibur pastiches of the 1970s and 80s. There was no denying the car was impressive though, as 600 horsepower and 7 miles per gallon were hypercar stats for the mid-2000s. The Isdera was far from a hypercar underneath however, as it was based on the Mercedes W126, a car that has ceased production 13 years prior. Certain exterior parts were also from the VW Beetle, which remarkably only stopped being built 3 years prior. Only one was built, and despite the intimidating Cruella-esque presence, I am not surprised. Notable non-manufacturer cars to use the system include the Honda CRX-2, built under Car and Driver's Project Synchronicity, the 2 Grant Oldsmobile Toronados, and the various Lou Fagile racing designs. Using 2 engines to provide 4-wheel drive seems like a foolish endeavour today, a naive solution to the then lack of road cars equipped to the system. But actually, if you look at cars available now, while twin-engine designs are nowhere to be seen, twin motors are everywhere. Lots of EVs use a system with one or more motors per axle with a shared battery, a very similar system in concept to one engine per axle with a shared fuel tank, no? If we consider these EVs as fair game, that means that cars like the higher spec Tesla Model Ys count, and that was the best selling car globally last year. Makes you wonder what other failed engineering ideas could work nowadays, doesn't it?